The woman who opened my father's front door was a stranger to me, and she was wearing my dead mother's wedding ring. She stood in the doorway of the house I grew up in, blocking it with her body the way you'd block a door against a salesman. And she looked at me with a small, practiced, sympathetic smile and said, "You must be Daniel. I'm so sorry, but your father isn't up for visitors today. He's very tired. Maybe call ahead next time." And then she began, gently, to close the door of my own father's house in my face. I put my hand flat against it. I kept my voice level because I have learned that the man who raises his voice first has already lost. And I said, "I'd like to see my father. Now." And behind her, from the dim hallway where a grandfather clock I'd known my whole life was still ticking, I heard my father's voice, thin and confused and frightened in a way I had never once heard it in 60 years of being his son. "Ruth?" he called out. "Ruth, is that you?" He was calling for my mother. My mother has been dead for 9 years. Stay with me, because what that woman did not know, standing in that doorway wearing my mother's ring, was that my father, years before his mind began to slip, had quietly built a trap for exactly this moment, and he had handed the key to that trap to the one person she had already decided did not matter. Me. My name is Daniel Vance. I teach history at a public high school 200 miles from the town where I grew up, and for most of my adult life that fact, that plain and unremarkable fact, was the great disappointment of my father's existence. I want to be honest with you from the start, because this is not a story about a perfect son rescuing a perfect father. My father, Raymond Vance, and I did not speak, not really, for the better part of 11 years. We were not enemies. We were something quieter and sadder than enemies. We were two proud men who had hurt each other once and never found the door back. Let me tell you who my father was, so you understand what was being stolen and why it mattered. Raymond Vance came out of nothing. His own father was a drunk who left, and my father went to work at 14 in a machine shop sweeping floors, and by the time he was 40 he owned that shop, and by the time he was 60 he had built it into Vance Precision, a manufacturing company that employed 300 people in our town of Millhaven and made components so exact that they ended up in aircraft and surgical instruments and things that had to work perfectly every single time or people died. My father built that, with his hands first and then with his mind, over 40 years, one impossible tolerance at a time. He was hard and he was fair, and he was respected in a way that money alone can never buy, the way a man is respected when 300 families' mortgages depend on his judgment and he has never once let them down. He wanted me to take it over. That was the whole of our sorrow, right there. From the time I was a boy he assumed, the way a certain kind of father assumes the sun will rise, that I would stand beside him at the plant and then, one day, in his place. And I loved him, and I loved the plant, the smell of cutting oil and hot steel, the sound of the machines, the men who called me Little Ray and meant it kindly. But I did not love it the way he needed me to. What I loved was teaching. What I loved was standing in front of a room of 16-year-olds and watching the moment a thing became clear to them, the moment history stopped being dead names and became a living argument they could hold in their hands. My father could not understand it. To him, I was walking away from a fortune, from a legacy, from him, to go and earn a teacher's salary explaining the past to other people's children instead of building a future beside my own father. We had the fight, the real one, the one that ends things, at my mother's funeral. That is the shameful truth of it, and I have carried it for 9 years. My mother, Ruth, was the bridge between us, the translator, the one who could make each of us legible to the other, and the day we buried her, with the earth still fresh, my father and I stood in the emptied-out kitchen of this same house and we said the unforgivable things to each other that grief unlocks in proud men. He said I had broken my mother's heart by abandoning the family. I said he had never once, not one time in my whole life, told me he was proud of the man I actually was instead of the man he'd wanted me to be. He turned his back on me. I drove home 200 miles that night. And for 11 years after that, we spoke on the telephone twice a year, on Christmas and on the anniversary of my mother's death, in the careful, wounded voices of men reading from a script, and I told myself there was time. I told myself we were both stubborn and one day one of us would soften and there would be time. There is never as much time as you tell yourself there is. Remember that. Whoever you are, whatever door in your own family you've been telling yourself you'll walk back through one day, remember that the time is so much shorter than you think. I should tell you about my mother because she is the reason any of this could be repaired, even from beyond her grave, and because the woman who wore her ring understood nothing about the woman whose ring she wore. Ruth Vance was a schoolteacher too, before she married my father. That is where I got it, the classroom in my blood, though my father could never see that his own wife had planted in me the very thing he resented me for loving. My mother was the softness that made my father's hardness bearable. When he came home from the plant with his jaw set and his hands raw, she was the one who could reach across and touch his arm and say a single quiet word and watch the granite in him go human again. She translated us to each other for 40 years. When I told my father, at 22, that I was going to teach instead of coming to the plant, it was my mother who sat between us at that same kitchen table and kept the two of us from saying the things that can't be unsaid. She held that piece together with her bare hands for 2 decades. And then she died, a stroke of her own, sudden in the kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, and the bridge between my father and me fell into the river with her, and neither of us knew how to build a new one, and so we simply stood on opposite banks for 11 years and called the distance pride. The fight, the real one, the one that ends things, happened at her funeral. That is the shame I have carried for 9 years, and I will not soften it for you, because you may be carrying one just like it, and you need to know you are not the only one. My mother's casket was barely in the ground. The mourners had gone, and my father and I stood in the emptied-out kitchen of this same house, the kitchen where she'd kept the peace for 40 years, and without her there to hold it, all of it came apart at once. He said I had broken her heart, that she had died wishing her only son had stood beside his father. It was the cruelest thing he could have said, and he knew it, and he said it anyway, because grief in a proud man comes out as a weapon or it does not come out at all. And I, God forgive me, gave it right back. I told him he had never once in my entire life told me he was proud of the man I actually was, that he had spent 22 years mourning the son he wanted instead of loving the son he had, and that Mom was the only one in this family who had ever actually seen me. He turned his back on me, physically turned, and faced the window, and would not turn around. And I walked out of my childhood home and drove 200 miles into the dark. And that was the last real conversation Raymond Vance and I had for 11 years. 2 phone calls a year. Christmas and the anniversary of the day she died. Careful, wounded, scripted, both of us waiting for the other to lay down the weapon first, both of us certain there would be time. Hold on to that, because it is the engine of everything that follows. I did not come home out of closeness. I came home because a stranger called me. And the miracle of this whole story, the thing I did not deserve, is that it turned out not to be too late. I found out about the marriage from a stranger. That is its own kind of wound, and I'll tell you how it happened. A woman named Dolores Kaminsky called me on a Tuesday evening in October while I was grading papers at my kitchen table. Dolores had been my father's controller, his money person, for close to 40 years. She knew where every dollar in Vance Precision lived and slept. She was 71 years old and should have retired a decade earlier and never would, because the plant was her life the way it was my father's. When I heard her voice on the phone, my stomach dropped, because Dolores Kaminsky did not call me. In 11 years, she had never once called me. Daniel, she said, and her voice was doing something I'd never heard it do. It was shaking. Daniel, I don't know if I should be calling you. I'll probably lose my job for it. But your father would never forgive me if I stayed quiet, or the man he used to be wouldn't, and I've decided I can live without the job easier than I can live with the silence. I set down my red pen. I said, Dolores, what's happened? And she told me my father's mind had been failing for over a year. Small strokes, the doctors thought, a series of them, each one taking a little more, some days sharp as ever and some days calling out for people long dead. She told me that 8 months ago he had fallen at the plant and they'd hired an in-home caregiver to look after him. A nurse, a woman named Vanessa. And she told me that 6 weeks ago, quietly, with no announcement, no family, no friends, in a courthouse 2 counties away, my father had married her. And that in the 6 weeks since, this Vanessa had let the housekeeper go, and let the old gardener go, and told the plant that Mr. Vance would no longer be taking calls or visitors, and had begun, Dolores said, her voice dropping to almost nothing, moving things, Daniel. She's moving money. She's had lawyers to the house. Not your father's lawyer, her own. There are documents. She's trying to get her name on the company. And nobody can get near him to know if he understands what he's signing. She's built a wall around him, Daniel, and I'm on the outside of it, and so are 300 families, and so are you. I want to describe to you the thing that happened in my chest when Dolores said those words, because it was not what I expected, and I think it's important. I expected rage. What I felt instead was something colder and older and much more useful. I felt myself go very still, the way my father used to go still on the plant floor when a machine was making a sound it shouldn't, that total quiet attention that comes before you fix a dangerous thing. Because underneath 11 years of hurt, underneath the teacher's cardigan and the graded papers, I was still Raymond Vance's son, and my father had taught me one lesson so deeply that no estrangement could ever burn it out. When something precious is being destroyed, you do not scream at the rubble. You find the load-bearing point and you brace it, and then, only then, do you deal with whoever swung the hammer. I asked Dolores one question that night. I asked, does she know about the trust? And there was a silence on the line, a long one, and then Dolores said, slowly, the Vance Family Voting Trust. And I said, yes, that one. And Dolores said, Daniel, I don't think she knows it exists. I don't think anyone's told her. Your father set it up years ago and never talked about it. The shares are in it. All of them. She's been having your father sign papers to transfer company stock to her. And I've been letting her lawyers believe those papers matter, and Daniel. And here Dolores Kaminsky, 71 years old, 40 years loyal, made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. Those papers don't matter. He can't transfer what he doesn't own anymore. He gave the shares to the trust 8 years ago. And do you know who the trust names as successor trustee, Daniel? Do you know who takes control the moment 2 doctors say your father can't manage his own affairs? I already knew. I had known since I was 49 years old, and my father, in the middle of our 11 years of silence, had a lawyer mail me a document I signed without fully understanding and filed in a drawer and tried not to think about, because thinking about it meant thinking about him. Me, I said. It names me. And Dolores said, it names you. Even when you two weren't speaking. Even then. He put the whole thing in your hands and never told you what it meant. I sat at my kitchen table with my students' half-graded papers in front of me, and I put my hand over my mouth so Dolores wouldn't hear the sound I made. Because in the middle of trying to understand a theft, I had just been handed the first real evidence in 11 years that my father, who could never say he was proud of me, had trusted me more than any person alive. I drove to Mill Haven the next morning. I called in a substitute. I kissed my wife Claire goodbye, and she held my face in her hands and said, go get your dad. And I drove the 200 miles I had not driven in far too long, and the whole way there I was not planning revenge. I want you to understand that. I was planning a rescue. The revenge came later, and it came because of what I found, and I'll tell you all of it, but that morning I was just a son driving home too late, praying to a God I'm not sure I believe in, that there was still enough of my father left inside that failing mind to know that I had come. Which brings us back to the doorway, and the stranger wearing my mother's ring. I did not force my way past Vanessa that first day. I want to tell you I did, but a man who has spent his life teaching teenagers has learned that the way to lose all your power is to use it too early. When my father called out for my mother from the dark hallway, I saw something flicker across Vanessa's face. Fast, there and gone, a flash of calculation, and in that flash I understood exactly who I was dealing with. She was not flustered. She was not a woman caught. She was a professional recalibrating. She turned back to the doorway with her sympathetic smile fixed back in place, and she said, you see, he's confused today. It upsets him to have new faces around. It's really better if you go, for his sake. I'll tell him you came by, for his sake. She said it the way you'd say it about a stranger you were doing a kindness. And I looked at this woman, perhaps 35, handsome in a hard, careful way, dressed with an expensive simplicity that was doing a great deal of work to look modest. And I made the first real decision of the war I did not yet fully know I was in. I smiled back at her. I made my smile as soft and harmless and defeated as I could. The smile of a sad, tired, unremarkable schoolteacher who knows he's been beaten. Of course, I said. You're right. I don't want to upset him. Thank you for taking such good care of my dad. It's a comfort to know he's not alone. And I watched her relax. I watched her file me away, exactly as I'd hoped, in the drawer marked harmless. He's told me so much about you, she lied warmly. Get some rest. Come by when you've called ahead. And she closed my father's door, gently this time, and I stood on the porch where I'd learned to ride a bike. And I let her think she'd won the first round, because letting people underestimate you is the single greatest weapon a quiet man will ever hold. My father taught me that too, though he never knew he was teaching it. He just lived it every day, a man in work clothes that people took for a laborer right up until the moment he owned the building. I did not drive home. I drove to the offices of Pfeiffer and Associates, on the second floor above the old savings bank on Millhaven's Main Street, and I climbed the stairs to see the one man in that town who I knew, with total certainty, was on my father's side and had been for 30 years. Gerald Pfeiffer had been Raymond Vance's attorney since before I could drive. He was pushing 80 now, half-retired, kept the office open mostly out of habit and loyalty to a handful of old clients, my father chief among them. When his secretary showed me in, Gerald looked up from his desk, and his face did something complicated, relief and grief and old affection all at once. And he stood up faster than a man his age should, and he came around the desk and he took my hand in both of his and he said, "Daniel, thank God. I've been trying to figure out how to reach you for a month, and I couldn't, because that woman controls his phone and I didn't have your number and I am too old and too frightened of doing the wrong thing. Sit down. Sit down, son. There is so much you need to know, and we may not have much time." And over the next 2 hours, in that dusty office above the bank, Gerald Pfeiffer laid out for me the full shape of what my father had built and what Vanessa was trying to break, and I understood that I had walked into something far larger and far more coordinated than a lonely old man's foolish marriage. Here is what my father had done years ago while his mind was still ablade. After my mother died, and I think partly because of the grief and partly because he was a man who had watched other men's fortunes get devoured by second wives and bad luck and predatory relations, Raymond Vance had gone to Gerald and built a fortress around Vance Precision. He placed 100% of the company's voting shares into an irrevocable trust, the Vance Family Voting Trust. While my father was competent, he controlled it completely. It changed nothing about his daily power. But the trust had a trigger. Upon the written certification of 2 independent physicians that Raymond Vance could no longer manage his own affairs, control of those voting shares would pass, automatically and irrevocably, to the successor trustee. And the successor trustee, named in a document I had signed at 49 and barely understood, was me. Not a spouse. Not a future spouse. The company could not be married into. It could not be seized through my father's signature, because my father, legally, no longer had shares to sign away. The trust did. Vanessa, chasing my father's stock, was chasing a thing that had not been his to give for 8 years. But Gerald, I said, if the company's protected, then what's she actually taking? What's the danger? And Gerald's face went grave, and he told me the danger, and the danger was enormous, because a fortress around the company was not a fortress around my father. Everything else was exposed. The house I'd grown up in, paid off, worth a fortune now. My father's personal bank accounts and investment accounts, the liquid savings of a frugal man over 40 years, millions of dollars. His personal name on things, his ability to sign, his vulnerability as a man whose mind came and went. Vanessa could not take the company. But through the marriage, through a power of attorney her lawyers had already gotten my father to sign on one of his foggy days, through a new will they were pushing, she could strip him personally of everything else, and worse, far worse, she controlled his body and his care and his access to the world. She could move him. She could change his doctors, the very doctors whose certification would trigger the trust. She could keep him just medicated enough, just isolated enough, just legally competent enough on paper to keep signing things, while privately he declined, and by the time anyone forced the issue she'd have drained the personal estate dry and vanished. And Gerald told me the last piece, the piece that turned my blood cold. She had been fighting, through her lawyers, to prevent any formal medical evaluation of my father's competence. She did not want 2 doctors certifying anything, and I understood why in an instant, and it was a horrible, elegant, evil understanding. Because the very thing that would trigger the trust and save the company, a finding that my father could not manage his affairs, was the one thing that would also strip Vanessa of her power to make him sign. She needed him legally competent to rob him. The moment he was declared incompetent, she lost her signing pen, and I gained a company. We were, without her knowing it, locked in a race toward the exact same finish line from opposite directions. And the prize at that finish line was my father's own broken mind. If you have followed this far, let me stop and ask you something. because I have turned it over 1,000 times since. When the only thing that can save someone you love is to prove, in a court, in writing, that they have lost the very mind that made them who they were, is it rescue or is it betrayal? To save my father's life's work, I would have to stand up in public and declare that the sharpest man I ever knew could no longer be trusted to sign his own name. He would have hated that more than he'd have hated losing the money. I knew that about him. So tell me, if you were in my place, would you have done it? Would you strip a proud man of his last dignity to save him from a thief? Hold that question. I'm not sure I ever fully answered it, even after everything. Stay with me and watch what I chose. The first thing I did was the same first thing my father would have done. I did not go after Vanessa. I went to brace the load-bearing point, and the load-bearing point was my father himself, his safety, his body, his access to me. I needed to get to him, really to him, in a lucid window, alone, without Vanessa in the room. And to do that, I needed to stop being the harmless sad son on the porch and start being something she'd never see coming. I rented a small apartment in Millhaven that week. I did not go home. I told the school I'd need a leave, and my principal, a good man, gave it to me without a fight when I told him my father was dying, which was true in more ways than one. And then I began, patiently, the slow work of getting inside the wall. I did not fight Vanessa. I befriended her. God help me, I made myself useful to her. I called ahead like she'd told me to. I brought groceries. I fixed the porch step that had been loose since I was a boy. I was warm and grateful and deferential, and I let her believe that the estranged son had come home guilty and grieving and desperate to make peace before the end, which, in a way she could exploit and I could hide behind, was even true. And slowly, because a predator relaxes when the prey behaves like prey, she let me in. Not far, but in. An hour on Sundays at first, always with her hovering. Then a little more. I want you to understand how hard that was, because I think if you have ever had to be kind to someone you were quietly at war with, you'll know. And if you never have, I hope you never do. Every Sunday I sat in my mother's kitchen and drank coffee with the woman who was killing my father by inches. And I complimented her cooking, and I asked her, gently, about herself, and I listened to her lies with an expression of grateful interest while everything in me wanted to put my hands around the truth and squeeze it out of her. She told me she'd trained as a nurse in a city she'd never lived in. She told me she'd fallen in love with my father's strength, his old-fashioned way. She told me once, watching my face carefully as she said it, that she knew the family hadn't approved of the marriage, but that she hoped in time I'd see she only wanted what was best for him. And I told her I could see how much she cared for him, and I watched her believe me, and I hated myself a little, and then I remembered my father calling out for my dead mother from a dark hallway, and the self-hatred burned off like fog and left only the work. The danger of being inside the wall is that the wall has eyes too. Twice I nearly lost everything to my own impatience. The first time, I was in my father's study while Vanessa thought I was in the bathroom, photographing the return addresses on the law firm envelopes with my phone, and I heard her footsteps in the hall and had just enough time to slide the mail back and pick up a framed photograph of my mother off the desk, so that when she opened the door she found a grieving son standing with his dead mother's picture in his hands, and her suspicion melted into something like sympathy, and she left me alone with it, and I stood there shaking, holding my mother's photograph like a shield my mother had handed me from the grave. The second time was worse. Vanessa came back into the kitchen while I was writing down the name off one of my father's pill bottles, and there was no photograph to hide behind, and she saw the bottle in my hand, and for one long, cold second the mask slipped and I saw the predator look straight out at me, weighing whether I was a threat. And I did the only thing that could have saved me. I made my face crumple and I said, in a thick voice, "I'm sorry. I want to understand what he's taking. I want to be able to help. I've missed so much. I don't even know my own father's medications." And I let a tear come, and it was not even a performance, not entirely, because the grief was real even if the helplessness was a lie, and I watched her decide that I was exactly the broken, guilty, harmless thing she'd filed me as, and she came and took the bottle from my hand almost tenderly and said, "You're a good son, Daniel. He's lucky to have you back." And I said thank you, and I meant a different thing by it than she heard, and the war went on, and she never suspected again. And in those hours I watched. I watched everything. I watched how she dosed my father's medications, and I quietly wrote down the names off the bottles when she left the room, and I looked them up at night in my rented apartment, and I found that among the drugs my father actually needed were two that a man in his condition had no business taking together. Two that would keep a person foggy, docile, sleepy, confused. I watched the mail, and I saw the envelopes from a law firm 2 counties over, the same county where they'd married, and from a wealth management outfit I'd never heard of. I watched her phone light up with texts from someone saved in her contacts only as D, and I watched her face soften and go private when she read them. The face of a woman texting not a client but a partner. I met D once, before I knew what he was. It was a Sunday, 6 weeks into my slow work of being harmless. And when I came for my hour, there was a strange car in the driveway and a man at my mother's kitchen table drinking coffee from my father's mug. Vanessa introduced him, smoothly, as her brother, in town for a few days to help her with some of the paperwork, since it's all so overwhelming. His name, she said, was Dorian. He stood and shook my hand, and his handshake was warm and firm and his eyes were friendly, and there was something underneath all of it. Some stillness, some watchfulness, that made the hair on my arms stand up before my mind understood why. He asked me kind, careful questions about my life, my school, my drive-in, and I answered them as the harmless grieving son, and all the while I felt myself being measured by a professional, the way a con man measures a mark, and I made very sure to measure small. He mentioned, in passing, so casually it would have slid right past a man who wasn't listening for it, that he had a bit of a finance background, and had offered to help Vanessa get your father's affairs organized so nothing falls through the cracks. Get his affairs organized. I smiled and said how kind, how lucky Vanessa was to have family close by, and I filed his face away, and his name, and the cold still thing underneath his warmth, and I understood, without yet having a shred of proof, that the sad lonely nurse story I was supposed to be swallowing had a second person at the table, and that the second person was the dangerous one. Back at my apartment that night, I wrote down every word he'd said while it was fresh. It was the first solid thing I had. A brother with a finance background who'd appeared at precisely the moment there was a fortune to organize. Even then, before Sam, before the folder, some part of me already knew that whatever this was, it had been done before and done well. And I watched my father. In his foggy hours, he was a stranger, gentle and lost, calling for my mother, asking me sometimes who I was. But every so often, for a few minutes, sometimes at dusk, the fog would lift, and my father would come back into his own eyes. And in those windows he was still Raymond Vance, and he knew me, and the first time it happened, the first time those sharp gray eyes found mine, and he said clearly, "Danny? Danny, what are you doing here?" I had to leave the room so he wouldn't see me break. It was in one of those windows. 3 weeks in, on an evening when Vanessa had stepped out to take a call from D on the porch, thinking I was harmless, thinking I was just sitting with a confused old man, that my father reached over and gripped my wrist with a strength that shocked me, and pulled me close and whispered fast because he knew the window was short, "Danny, listen to me. I'm not always here, but I'm here now, so listen. That woman is not my wife. I don't know what I signed. She gives me pills and the days go soft. I hid something. In the shop, in the old blue toolbox, the one that was my father's, under the tray. Gerald knows the rest. Don't let her." And then his grip loosened, and his eyes clouded, and the fog rolled back in like a tide, and he looked at me with polite confusion and said, "Are you the man about the furnace?" And I said gently, "Yes, Dad, I'm the man about the furnace. Everything's going to be all right." And he nodded, reassured, and I sat there holding the hand of a man who had just, for 90 seconds, clawed his way back through the fog to protect me, or to let me protect him, and I made him a promise in my heart that I would keep no matter what it cost. I would tear down that woman's whole world, but I would do it the way he taught me, quietly, completely, and only after every person I loved was safe. The old blue toolbox was still in the plant, in the corner of the shop floor that had been my father's, untouched, because the men wouldn't touch it because it was Raymond's. Dolores got me onto the floor after hours. Let me tell you about walking onto that plant floor at night for the first time in 11 years, because it undid something in me that needed undoing. Dolores let me in through the side door with a key she'd carried for 4 decades, and she turned on only the work lights, and the great machine stood silent in the half-dark, and the smell hit me, cutting oil and hot metal and something underneath it that was just the smell of my childhood, the smell of my father, and I stood in the doorway and I could not move for a moment. Dolores watched me. She was a small, fierce, gray woman in a cardigan not so different from my own, and she had given her whole life to this place, and she said quietly, "He used to stand right where you're standing, every night before he locked up, just looking at it, making sure it was all still here." And then she said the thing that has stayed with me. "You know, they call this place Vance Precision, but that was never really the name of it, not to the people who worked here. To us it was just Ray's. 300 families, Daniel, and every one of them knows that when the flood came in '09 and every other shop in the county laid off half their people, your father mortgaged his own house to make payroll and didn't let go of a single soul. That's what she was trying to steal. Not a company. Promise. 40 years of a man keeping his word to people who had nowhere else to go." I looked out at the silent machines and I understood, finally and completely, what a legacy actually is, the thing my father and I had spent 11 years unable to explain to each other. It was never the money. It was the 300 families. It was the word kept. And I understood that protecting it was not a betrayal of the teacher I'd chosen to be. It was the same job, standing in front of people who depend on you and refusing to let them down. My father and I had been doing the same work in 2 different buildings our whole lives, and been too proud to see it. And under the tray of the old blue toolbox, wrapped in an oiled rag the way you'd protect a precision tool, my father had hidden a thick envelope. Inside was a letter, in his own hand, dated a year earlier, when the strokes had just begun and he'd felt the ground starting to go. He had written it to me during the silence when we weren't speaking. It said that he could feel his mind starting to slip. It said he was afraid, and that he had never in his life admitted to being afraid of anything, and that he was admitting it to me now because there was no one else he trusted with his fear. It said that if I was reading this, then things had gone wrong, and that he was sorrier than he could write. For the 11 years, for my mother's funeral, for never saying the thing he should have said. And then, in the plain, blunt words of a man who built things for a living, he wrote the thing he could never say to my face. "I was wrong about your life. A man who spends his days making other people's children understand the world is not a man who walked away from anything. He is a man who understood what a legacy actually is better than his own father did. I am proud of you, Danny. I have always been proud of you. I was too proud myself to say it. Don't be like me. Say it while you can." I sat on the cold floor of my father's shop, under the machines he'd spent his life with, and I read my father tell me he was proud of me 11 years too late and exactly in time, and I wept the way a grown man weeps maybe twice in his life. And then I wiped my face, and I put the letter in my coat over my heart, and I got to work. Because grief that doesn't become action is just a monument to the thing you failed to protect. Also in that envelope were the things Gerald had helped him prepare. Copies of the trust. A signed, dated witness statement from a time when my father was indisputably competent, laying out his wishes and, crucially, his explicit fear that someone might one day try to exploit his declining mind, naming no one because there was no one yet, but describing the exact crime that was now being committed against him, as if he'd seen the whole future. And a card with the name and number of a man named Sam Okafor, and under it, in my father's hand, one word: investigator. I called Sam Okafor the next morning. "I have to tell you about the second front of this war, because up to now you might think this was simply a sad story of a lonely widower and an opportunistic nurse, and it was so much worse and so much more organized than that. Sam Okafor was a former state fraud investigator who now worked private, and my father had apparently met him and kept his card for exactly this rainy day. And when I laid out the situation for Sam, the marriage, the caregiver, the isolation, the brother texting as the out-of-county lawyers, Sam got very quiet, and then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Mr. Vance, I want to look into your stepmother's history before we do anything else. Because everything you're describing, the speed of it, the isolation playbook, the medication, the paper structure, the partner in the background, that's not amateur. That's not a nurse who got greedy. That's a pattern. And if it's a pattern, she's done it before." I felt the floor shift under me. "You think she's done this before?" And Sam said, "I think we should find out who Vanessa Vance was before she was Vanessa Vance. Give me 2 weeks." Took Sam 11 days. And what he brought me in a folder, in a diner on the edge of Millhaven, was the thing that turned my rescue into a reckoning. Vanessa was not her first name, or rather, it was one of several. Over the previous 9 years, in 3 different states, a woman matching her description using variations of her name, sometimes Vanessa, sometimes other things, had worked as a private caregiver for wealthy, ailing, isolated older men. 2 of them had married her. Both of those men had died within 18 months of the marriage. In both cases, significant assets had moved to her before their deaths. In both cases, adult children had raised alarms too late, after the money was gone and the trail was cold, and in both cases there had been no prosecution, because proving intent against a woman who could always say she was simply a devoted wife nursing a dying husband is one of the hardest things in the law. She had done it and gotten away clean and moved on, and my father, Raymond Vance, self-made, sharp as a blade right up until the strokes, had been marked as target number 3. And the man texting as D. Sam had a name for him now too. Dorian. Not her brother. Her partner. In one of the previous cases, he'd posed as the caregiver's brother. In another, as a financial advisor who conveniently appeared to help the grieving new wife manage the estate. He was the one who set up the paper structures, the LLCs, the out-of-county lawyers. Vanessa was the face. Dorian was the machine. And together they had, twice, turned a dying man's love into a fortune, and walked away, and left grieving children holding nothing but suspicion. Sam laid the 2 prior cases out for me in that diner the way a doctor lays out a diagnosis, plainly, because kindness in the delivery would only have made it harder to hear. The first man had been a widower in Oregon, 78, a retired timber executive, whose adult son had come home for Christmas to find a new girlfriend, installed in the house, and his father strangely diminished, slurring, sleepy, signing things. By the following autumn, the man was married. By the spring after that, he was dead, of what the certificate called natural causes, which for a frail old man is a phrase that closes far more doors than it opens. The son had gone to the police, and the police had listened politely, and had explained that being an unpleasant surprise of a stepmother is not a crime, that old men die, that a marriage is a marriage and a will is a will, and that there was nothing there they could take to a prosecutor. The money, most of it liquid, had already moved and moved again through accounts the son couldn't reach and lawyers who wouldn't talk. The son had spent 9 years since then telling anyone who would listen that his father had been murdered for his money and being treated, gently, as a man deranged by grief. The second case, in Arizona, was almost identical, down to the brother, who appeared to help manage the estate. A daughter this time, same playbook, same ending, same disbelief. And as Sam told me these 2 stories, I understood something that changed the whole texture of my rage. I was not fighting for my father alone. I was standing at the end of a line of ghosts, 2 dead men and their broken children, and I was, by pure chance and a loyal old woman's phone call and a hidden trust, the first person in 9 years who had been handed both the truth and the leverage to act on it before the ending was written. The others had gotten the truth too late, after the funeral, when suspicion was all that was left. I had gotten it while my father still breathed. That was the difference. That was everything. 2 families had been robbed of the chance I was holding in my hands, and I made a decision in that diner that went beyond my own father. I was not only going to save him, I was going to make sure that this time the pattern was seen, named, and stopped so that there would never be a 4th family sitting in a diner 9 years too late. I looked at that folder in the diner for a long time, and I want to tell you honestly what I felt because it was 2 things at once, and they did not cancel out. The first was a rage so pure and so total that my hands were shaking around my coffee cup. Rage not just for my father but for those 2 dead men and their children, robbed and disbelieved. And the second thing, right underneath the rage, was cold, clear, and almost grateful because Sam had just handed me the one thing that changes everything. Pattern. 2 previous victims. Because a devoted wife nursing 1 dying husband is unassailable. But a woman who has buried 2 wealthy husbands in 9 years and moved their fortunes each time, working with the same partner, running the same playbook, is not a wife. She is a serial predator, and predators, once you can prove the pattern, can be destroyed completely, legally, and in the full light of day. I did not need to just save my father. I could end her and Dorian both. And I could do it in a way that also warned every future victim she'd ever have. But I had to do it right, and I had to do it fast because my father's mind was a candle in a wind, and every foggy day was a day she could get another signature, and every clear day I stole with him was a gift I knew I was running out of. Here is where I have to tell you about the hardest decision of the whole thing, because it's the one that answers the question I asked you earlier. To save my father, and to trigger the trust, and to strip Vanessa of her signing pen, I needed 2 independent physicians to formally certify that Raymond Vance could no longer manage his own affairs. I needed to prove, on the record, that my father's mind was gone. And Vanessa's lawyers had been blocking exactly that for months, because they understood its power as well as I did. So I had to force it. And forcing it meant petitioning a court for a competency evaluation and, in the meantime, for emergency guardianship, on the grounds that my father was being isolated, medicated, and financially exploited by his caregiver wife. It meant walking into a courtroom and saying, in public, in front of my father if he was there to hear it, that the man who built Vance Precision from a broom and a dream could no longer be trusted to manage himself. Gerald warned me what it would do. Even in his fog, my father might understand enough to feel the shame of it. And in a clear window, if he had one on that day, it might break something in him that couldn't be fixed. I sat with that for 2 nights, and then I remembered the letter. Don't be like me. Say it while you can. And I understood that my father, the real one, the one who wrote that letter, had already made this decision for me. He had built the trust precisely so that his broken mind could not be used against the people he loved. He had, in effect, given me permission in advance to declare him fallen, if declaring him fallen was what it took to save everyone from the fall. It was not a betrayal of his dignity. It was the exact thing his dignity had planned for. So I filed. The morning I filed the petition, everything changed, and it changed fast, and it changed the way my father always said trouble comes, not gradually and then suddenly, but all at once, like a casting flaw that holds under 1,000 loads and then lets go under one. Vanessa was served at the house. And within an hour, Dolores called me to say that Vanessa had called the plant in a fury, demanding to speak to whoever thinks they run this company now. And that a man had shown up at the plant's front office, a man no one knew, well-dressed, calm, asking careful questions about the company's ownership structure and whether the shares were clear. Dorian had come out of the shadows. They knew someone had moved against them. They did not yet know it was me, the harmless sad schoolteacher who fixed the porch step, and they did not yet know about the trust. But they knew the game had changed, and a cornered predator is at its most dangerous, and I knew with a cold certainty that Vanessa's next move would be to try to move my father, to take him somewhere I couldn't reach, to a facility in another county, under a doctor she controlled, before the court could evaluate him. Sam had warned me this was the pattern's endgame. Isolate, then relocate, then run out the clock. I had days, maybe hours. What happened next happened over 72 hours, and I have lived them 100 times since. Let me tell you all of it. The first thing Sam did, the moment we learned Dorian had surfaced at the plant, was tell me to assume they would try to move my father that night. They know the clock is running now, he said. The evaluation petition is filed. Every hour your father stays reachable is an hour they might lose control of the story. If they're smart, and they are, they'll relocate him tonight somewhere across a county line under a facility and a physician they've already lined up. Once he's behind those doors, getting him back could take months, and he doesn't have months. So we did not wait for them to move. We moved first. Gerald and I went before an emergency duty judge that same afternoon. A thing that is not easy to arrange and that Gerald, in 50 years of practice and every favor he'd ever banked, made happen. And I stood in front of that judge, a tired man in a teacher's coat with a folder full of a stranger's crimes, and I asked for 2 things. A temporary emergency order barring the removal of Raymond Vance from his home and the interference with his access to his own family, and an expedited, independent competency evaluation to be conducted by court-appointed physicians, not Vanessa's, within 48 hours. I had never been in a courtroom in my life except for jury duty, and now I was standing in one asking a judge to reach into my family and pull my father out of a fire. Gerald did the legal speaking in the dry, precise language of a man who has done this for half a century, but at the end the judge looked past him, at me, and asked me directly why she should believe this was an emergency and not simply a family that disapproved of a marriage. And I understood that everything hung on the next thing I said, and I did not reach for legal language because I don't have any. I told her the truth. I told her about a phone call from a woman who'd worked for my father for 40 years and risked her job to make it. I told her about a stranger in my mother's ring closing a door in my face while my father called out for a wife 9 years dead. I told her about pill bottles I'd photographed and looked up at night, two drugs that should never share a bloodstream. I told her about a man texting as a single letter, and out-of-county lawyers, and a fortune quietly moving. And then I said the thing that I think actually moved her because it was the thing I was most ashamed of. I said, "Your Honor, I wasn't there. My father and I didn't speak for 11 years, and that's my fault as much as his, and I will carry it forever. I don't come to you as a devoted son who never left. I come to you as a man who almost left it too late, and who found out by pure luck that there was still time, and who is asking you for the hours it takes to not lose him twice." The judge looked at me for a long moment after that. I think she had seen a great many devoted children in her courtroom, and something about a son admitting he'd nearly failed landed as truer than devotion ever could. The judge, a woman with silver hair and the kind of eyes that have seen every human ugliness and are no longer surprised by any of it, read Sam's folder in silence for a long time. The pattern, the two prior husbands, the 18 months, the money that moved and the children who were disbelieved. And when she looked up, something in her face had changed, the way a person's face changes when an abstract legal filing becomes, in front of them, a living person in danger. She granted both orders, and she said something off the record quietly that I have kept with me. She said, "Mr. Vance, I have signed a great many of these too late. I am glad, for once, to sign one in time. Go home and protect your father." I walked out of that courthouse with a piece of paper that was, in the truest sense, a wall, and I drove to my father's house to stand in front of it. I got there at dusk, and I was not a minute too soon, because there was a medical transport van already backed up to the front walk, and two attendants I didn't recognize, and Vanessa on the porch in a coat with a bag over her shoulder, directing them, and my father, in a wheelchair on the porch in his pajamas and a blanket, confused, blinking in the cold, being loaded like freight into the back of a van to be taken somewhere I would never have found him in time. I have never moved so fast in my life. I put my car sideways across the end of the driveway, blocking the van, and I got out, and I was not the harmless schoolteacher anymore, and Vanessa saw it, saw the change in me, and for the first time since I'd met her, the practiced sympathy dropped off her face like a mask hitting the floor, and what was underneath was flat and cold and unafraid, and I understood I was finally seeing the real woman who had buried two men. "You can't take him," I said, and I held up the order, and I kept my voice level even though my heart was a hammer. "There's a court order, signed 2 hours ago. You remove him from this house tonight and you are in criminal contempt, and given what else is in the file, you do not want to add that charge to the ones that are coming." Vanessa looked at the paper. She did not take it. She looked at me, and she smiled. A small, genuine, chilling smile. The first honest expression I'd seen from her. And she said, "You're smarter than you pretended to be. I'll give you that. Most of the children are so busy being sad they never think to be smart." And there it was. The children, plural. She'd said it without even meaning to, the tell of a person who has done this so many times that the victims have blurred into a category. And a man's voice behind me said, smooth and reasonable, "Vanessa, enough." Dorian had arrived. I want to describe Dorian to you because he was the more dangerous of the two, and he did not look it. Vanessa was ice, Dorian was oil. He was pleasant. He was calm. He came up the walk with his hands open and his voice warm and reasonable, and he said, "Mr. Vance, Daniel, this is all a terrible misunderstanding, and I think we can resolve it like reasonable people, without courts, without ugliness, in a way that's best for your father and, frankly, best for everyone's interests, including yours." And he began gently to make me an offer. He talked about how litigation was expensive and slow and uncertain, how these family matters were always so painful, how a sensible arrangement, a number, a settlement could let everyone move forward. He was offering to pay me, to go away. He named a figure. It was a large figure. He watched my face while he said it, the way a man watches a scale, and I understood that this too was part of the playbook, that at this exact stage in two previous states some grieving, exhausted, outmatched child had looked at a number like that and decided the fight wasn't worth it, and had taken it and had spent the rest of their life knowing they'd sold their parents' dignity to make the ugliness stop. And I looked at Dorian, and I looked at Vanessa, and I looked at my father shivering in a wheelchair in the cold beside a van meant to disappear him, and I said the truest thing I have ever said to anyone. "You've made a mistake that the last two families didn't get to explain to you," I said. "So let me." Those men were alone. My father is not alone. He was never alone, not even when I wasn't here, because a long time ago, when his mind still worked better than yours ever will, he built something neither of you could see and neither of you could break, and he handed it to me, and you have spent this whole time robbing a house whose deed was never in the drawer you were digging through. I saw it land. I saw Dorian's smooth face go still, that first flicker of a professional realizing the ground is not where he thought it was. I know about Harold Ashworth in Oregon, I said, and Vanessa's head turned sharply. I know about the man in Arizona. I know how long each of them lasted after they married you. I know your name isn't Vanessa. I know Dorian isn't your brother. I have an investigator, a folder, 2 families who have been waiting 9 years for someone to believe them, and a court that just read all of it and signed an order in under an hour. You are not negotiating a settlement. You are standing in a driveway that is about to become a crime scene, and the only choice left to you is how fast you'd like to run. For a moment, nobody moved. The 2 transport attendants had stopped, frozen, sensing they'd wandered into something that was not on their work order. Vanessa's eyes had gone flat and hard, doing the arithmetic of a person who has always had an exit and is realizing, for the first time, that this one might not. And then, from the wheelchair, from under the blanket, in the cold blue dusk, my father spoke. It was one of his windows. Maybe the confrontation cut through the fog, maybe it was chance, but Raymond Vance surfaced right there in that driveway, and his gray eyes cleared, and he looked from Vanessa to me and back again, and he understood, in the way a drowning man breaks the surface and grabs one full breath of the whole situation, exactly what was happening. And he said, in a voice that was thin but unmistakably his own, unmistakably the voice that had run a plant floor for 40 years. Danny, is that my son? And I said, yes, Dad, it's me. I'm here. And my father turned his cleared eyes on the woman wearing my mother's ring. The woman he'd been too foggy and too isolated and too drugged to truly see for months, and something terrible and lucid passed across his face, and he said quietly, I want to go inside my house, and I want her to leave it. 6 months of fog, and in one clear breath he had said the only 2 things that mattered, and he had said them as a witness, in front of a stranger's transport crew and a sheriff's deputy pulling up the road, and Vanessa understood in that moment that the man she'd been treating as already gone had just, for 10 seconds, come all the way back to bury her. If you have made it this far into my father's story, let me ask you the question I most need answered, because it has haunted me since that driveway. When a predator offers you a fortune to walk away and let them finish what they started, and taking it would end your own pain instantly, and fighting will cost you everything and might still fail, where is your line? How much would someone have to offer you to abandon the person who once carried you? I know what I answered in that driveway. I need to know what you would answer. Tell me in the comments, and tell me if you've ever had to stand in a doorway like that one, because I promise you someone reading this is standing in that doorway right now, tonight, and they need to know how you chose. Dorian ran. Not that night, not physically, not yet, but I watched the decision happen behind his eyes, the cold arithmetic of a professional calculating that this one had gone wrong and the smart move was to cut losses and disappear before the machine he'd built could be traced back to him. He tried once more, his voice losing its oil, going hard, a threat now instead of an offer, something about how I had no idea what I was starting, and I told him I had a sheriff's deputy on the way because violating a fresh emergency order tends to get their attention, which was true. Sam had made the call the moment we saw the van. And when the deputy's headlights actually did come up the road, Dorian melted back down the walk and into the dark and was, by the time anyone thought to look for him, gone. Vanessa was made of harder and stupider stuff, or perhaps she simply had more to lose by running, a marriage certificate binding her to the estate she still thought she might salvage. She stayed. She stayed and she smiled and she told the deputy a smooth story about a confused family and a misunderstanding. And the deputy, God bless him, looked at the court order in my hand and the old man shivering in the wheelchair and said the marriage certificate didn't outrank a judge's signature and that Mr. Vance was going back inside his own house tonight, and if Mrs. Vance had a problem with that, she could take it up in the courtroom on the date printed right there on the paper. We took my father back inside. I lifted him out of that wheelchair myself, my arms under his, the way you'd lift someone precious and breakable, and he was so light, so much lighter than the giant of my childhood. And as I settled him into his own bed in his own room, he came up out of the fog for a moment, just a moment, and his eyes found mine, and he said, Danny, just my name. And I said, "I'm here, Dad. I'm not going anywhere. You're home. You're safe. I've got it from here." And he studied my face with those gray eyes for a long, clear second, and something in him eased. Some vigilance he'd been holding even in his confusion finally let go, and he said, "I know you do. You always did have it, son. I just never told you." And then he slept, really slept, the first peaceful sleep I think he'd had in months, because for the first time in a year there was someone in that house who loved him standing between him and the dark. I did not sleep that night. I sat up in the hallway outside his door in a kitchen chair, the way you'd stand a watch, because I did not fully trust that Vanessa or Dorian wouldn't try something in the dark. And because after 11 years away I was not going to spend a single hour of being back in the same house as my father asleep in another room. Sometime after midnight I went quietly through the house, and I gathered every pill bottle Vanessa had been dosing him from, and I set them on the kitchen table under the light, and I photographed each one again, carefully, the labels, the dates, the counts, because Sam had told me that the medication was not just cruelty, it was evidence, and that a chart showing a caregiver administering a dangerous combination to keep a competent man foggy was the kind of thing that turned a civil suspicion into a criminal case. In the morning I called the court-appointed physicians myself, and I called my father's real doctor, the one from before Vanessa, the one she'd quietly replaced, and within a day the two drugs that had no business sharing a bloodstream were gone, and I sat with my father through the hard days as they cleared out of him, and I watched, hour by hour, a little more of my father come back up through the fog like a diver rising toward light. He would never surface all the way. The strokes had taken what they'd taken. But the part Vanessa had stolen with a pill bottle, that part came back, and getting even a piece of my father returned to me after I'd already begun to grieve him was a mercy I still don't have adequate words for. The competency evaluation happened 2 days later, and it was gentle and it was thorough, and the two court-appointed physicians reached the conclusion that everyone but Vanessa's paid lawyers had known for a year. Raymond Vance could no longer manage his own affairs. And the moment those two certifications were signed and filed, a thing happened silently, legally, irreversibly, that Vanessa and Dorian had never seen coming because they never knew it existed. The Vance family voting trust triggered. Control of 100% of the voting shares of Vance Precision passed automatically to the successor trustee. To me, every document Vanessa had gotten my father to sign transferring company stock was revealed as worthless, because it transferred shares my father hadn't personally owned in 8 years. The fortress held. The 300 families held. The company my father built from a broom was safe, and it was safe because a proud, frightened, brilliant old man had, in the middle of not speaking to his son, trusted that son with everything that mattered and told no one, least of all the son. And then the reckoning came for Vanessa, and it came exactly as thoroughly as I had promised her it would in that driveway, and I did not have to swing a single hammer because all I had to do was hand the truth to the people whose job it is to act on it and then step back and let the structure fall. Sam's folder went to the county prosecutor, and the prosecutor, unlike the overwhelmed offices in 2 other states years before, had something those offices never had: a living, protected victim, a court already involved, a documented pattern, and the contact information for 2 families in 2 other states who had spent 9 years being told they had no case. Those families came. I spoke to both of them myself on the phone late at night, the son of the man in Oregon and the daughter of the man in Arizona, and I will not tell you what those conversations were like because some griefs are not mine to hand to strangers, but I will tell you that both of them wept when they understood that someone had finally stopped her, and that their father's stories would finally be believed, and that they would not have to testify into a void. They flew in for the hearing. The one that mattered, the consolidated proceeding where the guardianship was made permanent and the marriage was challenged, was held in a plain county courtroom on a gray morning, and I will remember that room for the rest of my life. Vanessa was there, in a modest dark dress chosen to make everyone think of a grieving widow, with a lawyer who had clearly been well paid and was clearly beginning to understand he'd been paid to defend the indefensible. And across the aisle from her sat 3 families. Mine. And the son from Oregon, a big quiet man in his 50s who had spent 9 years being called crazy by everyone he told. And the daughter from Arizona, who gripped a framed photograph of her father the entire time. Vanessa had spent a decade counting on the fact that her victims were always alone, always isolated, always a single grieving voice easy to dismiss as bitter or unbalanced. She had never once, in all her careful years, had to sit in a single room with 3 of them at the same time. I watched her face as the Oregon sun took the stand and described, in flat, careful, devastating detail. The exact playbook, the isolation, the fog, the sudden marriage, the brother who wasn't a brother, and I watched her understand that the very thing that had always protected her, the loneliness of the people she preyed on, had finally, in this one room, become the thing that would destroy her. There is a particular silence that falls in a courtroom when everyone present, including the accused, realizes the outcome is no longer in doubt. That silence fell, and Vanessa, who had buried two men and smiled in two doorways, sat inside it, and for the first time I saw something on her face that was not calculation. It was the look of a predator who has finally, after 9 years of daylight never quite reaching her, been seen in full sun by too many eyes to ever hide from again. The marriage was challenged and undone, void from the start, a fraud committed against a man who lacked the capacity to consent. The assets Vanessa had already moved were frozen and, over the following year, clawed back, dollar by dollar, into my father's estate. And Vanessa herself, who had buried two husbands and walked away twice, was arrested and charged, and this time with 3 states and 3 families and one relentless investigator all pointing at the same pattern. She did not walk away. Dorian was harder to catch because oil is harder to hold than ice, but a man who has run one too many of the same scheme leaves one too many traces, and the last I heard, the machine of the law was closing on him too, slowly, the way my father always said justice comes, not gradually and then suddenly, but the other way, grinding and patient and sure. There is one more thing from the reckoning that I have to tell you, because it is small, and it mattered more to me than all the frozen accounts and clawed back millions combined. My mother's ring. When the marriage was undone and Vanessa's things were removed from my father's house, the ring she had been wearing, my mother's wedding ring, the one she'd worn for 40 years and that my father had kept in a small box on his dresser after she died and that Vanessa had simply taken and put on her own hand to sell the lie, was returned to me in a plain envelope by a court clerk who had no idea what she was handing over. I drove to my father's house. It was a good day, he was clear. And I sat beside him and I opened the envelope and I put my mother's ring in his palm and closed his fingers around it. And my father looked down at it for a long time and he understood exactly what it was and where it had been and what it meant that it was home. And this hard man who built things that could not fail, who had not wept at his own wife's funeral because his grief came out as granite, sat in his chair and closed his fist around Ruth's ring and finally, 9 years late, cried for her. I held him while he did. It is the only time I ever saw my father cry, and I was glad to be there for it, glad past all words because a man should not have to grieve the great love of his life alone, and for 9 years because of a fight in a kitchen mine had. I need to tell you about my father's last good year because this is not, in the end, a story about revenge no matter how it started. It is a story about a son who came home too late and found out it was not, after all, too late for the only thing that mattered. Once Vanessa was gone and the 2 medications that had no business being in the same man were taken away, my father came back. Not all the way. The strokes were real and the damage was real, and I will not lie to you and tell you love cured him. Because love does not cure a failing brain, and anyone who's walked this road with a parent knows the particular heartbreak of that truth. But he came back enough. Cleared of the fog those drugs had kept him in, cared for by people who loved him instead of a woman counting the days until he died. My father had more good hours, more clear windows, more afternoons where he was himself. I moved back to Millhaven. I want you to know that I did not do it grudgingly and I did not do it as a sacrifice. I did it because there was nowhere on this earth I would rather have been than in that house with the time we had left. Claire came too. My wife, who had held my face in her hands and told me to go get my dad, packed up our life 200 miles away and brought it to Millhaven without my ever having to ask, because that is who she is, and because she had lost her own father young and understood, better than I did, exactly what kind of hours these were and how few of them there would be. She moved into that house and she made it a home again, filled it with cooking smells and open windows, and she sat with my father on the days I had to be at the plant, and he came to love her and she to love him, and some afternoons I would come back to find the 2 of them on the porch, my hard old father and my gentle wife, doing a crossword together in the last light, and I would stand at the end of the walk for a moment before they saw me, just looking at it the way my father used to. Stand and look at his silent machines, making sure it was all still here. It was the house where a stranger had once tried to turn me away at the door, and now it was full again of the only people in the world who belonged in it. That, more than the courtroom, more than the trust, more than the ruin of the 2 people who tried to steal it all, was the victory. Not that I destroyed what came to take my father. That I got to fill his last good days with the family. A fight in a kitchen had cost us both for 11 years. I kept teaching 2 courses at the community college because my father, in one of his clear windows, took my hand and told me not to give up the thing that made me myself, that he had learned that lesson too late and would not watch me learn it at all. And I ran the company, his company, through the trust, not because I had become a businessman overnight, but because 300 families were counting on someone who cared more about them than about the money, and my father had spent 40 years being exactly that someone, and I found, to my surprise, that I could be that someone too, that the plant and the classroom were not as different as we'd both spent 11 years believing, that both were, in the end, about standing in front of people who depended on you and refusing to let them down. I did not run it alone, and I did not pretend to be my father. I found the good people he'd trained, Dolores first among them, and I trusted them the way he had, and I made the decisions only I could make and let them make the rest. But there was one decision early on that I think would have made him proudest, and I want to tell you about it because it's the truest measure of what he actually left me. 6 months after I took over, a larger competitor made an offer to buy Vance Precision. It was a very good offer. It was, frankly, more money than I had ever imagined being connected to my name, and all I had to do was sign, and I would never have to think about tolerances or payroll or 300 families again, and I could go back to my classroom a wealthy man. And I asked the buyers one question. I asked what they intended to do with the Millhaven plant. And they gave me the answer those buyers always give, smooth and regretful about efficiencies and consolidation and difficult but necessary decisions. And I understood they meant to gut it, to move the work overseas within 2 years and put 300 families in our town out on the street. And I thought about my father mortgaging this very house in '09 to keep from laying off a single soul. And I said no. I turned down a fortune the way my own father had once watched me turn down a fortune to go be a teacher, except this time I turned it down for exactly the reason he'd built the whole thing in the first place. Dolores cried when I told her. And that night I sat with my father on the porch, and on that day he was clear enough to understand when I told him what I'd done, and he didn't say anything for a while, and then he reached over and gripped my wrist the way he had that first evening through the fog, and he said, "Now you understand it. It was never the company, Danny. It was the people. You finally understand what I couldn't ever say." And I did. 11 years, 2 men too proud to speak, and in the end my father and I turned out to have believed the exact same thing our whole lives and simply never found the words to know it. We had our afternoons. On the good days I would will him out to the plant, and the men who'd called me Little Ray 30 years before, older now, gray now, would come and shake his hand and tell him the company was in good hands, and he would look at me, and I would see him understand and be at peace. On the good days we sat on the porch he'd carried me onto as a boy, the porch where a stranger had once tried to turn me away, and we did not talk about Vanessa, and we did not talk about the 11 years because we had already said, both of us, in a hidden letter and in a dark bedroom, the only things that needed saying. We talked about my mother. We talked about the shop. Some evenings we just sat, and the grandfather clock ticked in the hall, and it was enough. There was one evening in particular I have to give you, because it answered the last question I had been carrying, the one that had nothing to do with Vanessa. It was a warm evening late in that first good summer, and we were on the porch, and my father was clear, and I finally asked him the thing I'd wondered since the night Dolores said my name into the phone. I asked him why. Why, in the middle of 11 years of not speaking, when we sent each other nothing but 2 stiff phone calls a year, he had made me, of all people, the successor trustee. Why he had put everything he'd built into the hands of the son he couldn't even talk to. And my father was quiet for a long time, looking out at the yard going gold in the evening light, and then he said, "Because trust and closeness aren't the same thing, Danny. I didn't know how to be close to you. I never learned it. My own father didn't leave me any tools for it, and I was too stubborn to go find my own. But not being able to talk to you was never the same as not knowing you." He turned and looked at me. "I knew exactly who you were. A man who'd walk away from a fortune to do work that didn't pay because he thought it mattered. A man who kept his word to a room full of other people's kids for 30 years and never once asked for anything back." His voice caught just slightly, the only time I ever heard it do that. Who else would I trust with 300 families? The men who wanted the money? I needed someone who'd never wanted it. That was always you. Wanting the money was the one thing I could count on you never to do. And I understood, sitting on that porch, that my father had spent 11 years unable to say I love you and had instead said it in the only language he had, the language of a man who builds things, by putting his entire life's work into my hands and trusting it would be safe there. The trust was not a legal document. It was a love letter written by a man who'd never learned the words, in the only alphabet he knew. And I had signed it at 49 without understanding a thing. It was more than enough. It was everything the 11 years had cost us, handed back in installments in the last light of the day. My father died 2 springs later, at home, in his own bed, in the house he'd paid for with 40 years of his hands, with me holding one of his hands and Dolores Kaminsky, 42 years loyal, holding the other. He was clear at the end. That is the mercy I was given, the one I did not deserve and will be grateful for until my own last breath. He was clear, and he knew me, and the last thing my father ever said to me, in a whisper with the last of his voice, was the thing he'd written in a letter and hidden in a toolbox against the day his own mind might rob him of the chance to say it out loud. "I'm proud of you, Danny." And then, a breath later, so quiet I almost missed it, "Tell them, whoever's listening, tell them not to wait like we did." So I'm telling you, that was his instruction to me, and I'm passing it to you because he wanted me to, because a man who spent his life making things that had to work perfectly wanted his last words to do some work in the world. Here is what I learned, and it is the only thing I have to give you at the end of all this. There is a woman in a doorway in more houses than you would ever believe, right now, tonight, wearing someone's dead mother's ring, smiling a practiced smile, gently closing a door on someone who loves the person trapped inside. The predators who hunt our old people are real, and they are patient, and they are good at it, and they count, above all, on 2 things. That the elderly are isolated, and that their children are too busy, too far away, too tired, or too estranged to come in time. Do not give them the second thing. Whatever door in your own family you have been telling yourself you'll walk back through one day, whatever call you keep meaning to make, whatever pride you're waiting for the other person to lay down first, I am begging you, with the full weight of what it nearly cost me, do not wait. Go home. Make the call. Say the thing. My father and I lost 11 years to 2 men's stubbornness, and we got them back only by a miracle and a hidden letter and a loyal old woman who risked her job to dial a phone. And most people do not get the miracle. Most people just get the 11 years and then the funeral and then the rest of their life wishing. And if you are the child who did come home, the one who walked into the doorway and found the stranger wearing the ring, then hear this from someone who has stood exactly where you're standing. Do not scream at the rubble. Find the load-bearing point and brace it and be patient and let them underestimate you, because a quiet person who loves someone completely and refuses to be moved is the most dangerous thing a predator will ever meet. They are counting on your grief to make you careless and your exhaustion to make you cheap. Be the thing they don't expect. Be the wall. Build the trap the way my father did, out of patience and love and preparation, and spring it only when everyone you're protecting is safe. Your parents spent your whole childhood being the wall between you and the cold. There is a season in a life when the child becomes the wall, and if you are lucky enough and awake enough to recognize that season when it comes, do not sleep through it. It is the last, hardest, and greatest gift you will ever give the person who gave you everything. My name is Daniel Vance. A woman I'd never met opened my father's door and told me he wasn't up for visitors, and she was wearing my mother's ring, and my father was calling out for a wife 9 years dead. And I smiled, and I let her think I was no one, and I went to work. Because my father taught me, without ever once saying it out loud, that the quiet man they seat at the end of the table, the one they're sure doesn't matter, is so often the one holding up the house. He held up mine my whole life. In the end, I got to hold up his. If you have someone like that still living, still reachable, still yours, then stop listening to an old story about a stranger and go call them. Tell them the thing. Do it tonight. Do it before there's a woman in the doorway. That's the whole lesson. That's the only thing I have. Say it while you can.